Welcome back to part two of Psychoanalysis Every Day, the game of omnipotence. So far, we have tried to discuss about what exactly omnipotence is, how it operates, and somewhere we were in the discussion where we were talking about the everyday to day life examples. Sir, you also mentioned that it's a journey. There's a pathway we all take, and there are different stages to it,
Right.
different places where we project it. So somewhere you were mentioning about the different film stars, the political leaders, how the game goes on.
Correct. We can also see how people fight over Narendra Modi, a very common projection of omnipotence, both positive and negative. And then we have retail shops, which are upmarket retail shops.
Again, I have a question there. So, would um, though leadership is a different set of skills a person would have, but the followers would definitely look up for the the undercurrent would be the omnipotence for the followers, but
Correct.
for the leaders, what it is like
Uh,
anybody who's leading.
yeah, I'll just give me a moment. I'll come to it because this is a very important second part of it. Ki, how they feel about it.
Yes.
Two questions about it. That when the
Yeah.
followers project omnipotence, what happens to the leaders inside? That is one part. And the second part is what do the leaders themselves look up to? So the leaders, this is the question that you have asked. Second part I'll deal slightly later. But the leaders are also driven by omnipotence. It is the what Nietzsche used to say, a drive to power, a drive to overpower, the drive to an endless power. So they are driven by power, by control, by being omnipotent, that they are the final arbiters of our destiny. And they have their names in the history books. So they want to approach omnipotence through these things. And some of them also approach omnipotence through money, which they acquire through power. So the leaders themselves are also driven by omnipotence. Every leader, not only political leader, even a corporate leader is driven by omnipotence. So every leader in whatever field he is driven to different degrees by omnipotence. And some of the good ones are driven by omnipotence invested in an ideology.
Yes.
So they are the more idealistic types, that they are not driven by so much by personal power. Of course, they are driven, but less by personal power and more by ideology, where they have invested omnipotence in an infallible ideology. So for RSS, it will be Hindutva. For communists, it will be Marxism. For Western world, it will be liberal capitalism. So they are strongly invested in an ideology and they project omnipotence on that ideology, including feminism, including spirituality, that they invest omnipotence in one book or in one enlightened person. So this investment of omnipotence is everywhere. And the leader of the spiritual movement then invests his omnipotence in God. Because you can invest your omnipotence somebody above you. Now, when there are few people above you, you either invest it in some great guru who has written books that you cannot write, who has achieved states that you cannot achieve, or in God. When nobody is left, then in God.
Even in Sanatan, we are left with many of the stories where the Lord Shiv is projecting his omnipotence on Vishnu. Vishnu is projecting on Shiva, and it is very cyclic. It is just on each other, and each other.
So mythology often is created because one needs some entity on whom omnipotence can be projected. So that often is one of the motivations, not the only motivation, but one of the motivations for creating mythological stories.
So man has been creating things just to fulfill the psychic, a thing in concrete forms.
Correct. We can look at retail shops, the upmarket retail shops, which create that classy, rich, out of this world look and people who go there almost feel compelled to purchase, that you cannot go out of that shop without purchasing anything. There's so much of the pressure of that omnipotence on that person. And instead of feeling the customer is the king, you feel the shop is the king. And he is doing us a favor by allowing us in, instead of
Even the
feeling the other
brands.
way, that we are doing him a favor by buying his product.
Hmm.
Other, we feel the other way, we have been obliged by allowing us into the shop and buying from them. There is so much of that omnipotence created by brand management, advertising, and so on. Art is another example where omnipotence is in full play. You can see characters, you can see worship of the guru, you can see worship of an art form itself, but you'll always have omnipotence almost flying freely in the world of art. And we all want surreal characters. Nobody wants the character of the uncle next door to be the character of the novel. So in history, we see this very, very blatantly. Like when the British Empire was there, all the Britishers who were soldiers in India or bureaucrats in India, they would all count themselves as loyal servants of the gracious queen. And dying for the gracious queen was believed to be something very elevated thing to do. And the omnipotence was projected into the gracious queen.
Hmm.
Same historically you see in Japan, omnipotence was projected into the emperor. He is supposed to be the son of the sun god. And when the nuclear bombs were thrown, and Japan had to surrender, and the emperor came on radio and announced the surrender, you had teenagers, old people, everyone crying on the street. How can the emperor apologize? They had forgotten the misery of the atomic attacks. They had forgotten the destruction, but that omnipotence could not be broken. They were weeping on the streets that the emperor should not apologize because then he's not omnipotent. So maintaining of that omnipotence was even more central to their psyche at that point than practically thinking about the defeat and the atomic attacks and what would come next if you don't surrender. So the human mind can be taken up by the fantasy of omnipotence, and he may just put aside all his practical suffering and all the practical thinking. Omnipotence can just kick reality acceptance up in the air and take the throne. You can see Hitler in his grand parades. He used to organize those grand get-togethers, grand parades. And you can see how people would project omnipotence on Hitler. Right? Even shaking the hand or looking at him, people would start weeping. The Führer can do no wrong. And people are ready to lay down their life for the Führer.
Right.
And that is how it used to be with kings. That omnipotence was projected onto the king, and people thought it to be a great favor done to them if they were able to die for the king. And similarly, we can have omnipotence projected in the country, that the soldier is ready to die for the country, to die for the motherland. And the omnipotence is projected into the motherland. What happens is that if you organize a function grand enough and you do enough communication that you are out of this world, people are just waiting for somebody so that they can project. The need for
Hmm.
omnipotence is so high. They are just waiting for an object to appear who has narcissism enough to say, I am omnipotent, and they're just waiting to project. It's so addictive that people always are in search of omnipotent figures. And that's one of the reasons why the communist politics does not work, because it does not take into account the fantasy, the surreal, and the omnipotent component of the psyche. It tries to make it too real, which is not interesting to anybody. And this tells us that on one hand, we are such a practical species, on the other, we are such an impractical species.
And that's what I was thinking about.
So there's a
Does
very
this mean
famous,
that even the passion has a flavor of omnipotence?
yes,
Passion towards something?
yeah,
But in an experiential form, there is that the satisfaction and the gratification we get out of doing such. Suppose somebody is into music, somebody is into some philosophy, some science, something, and the kind of gratification they get, it is the fulfillment of projection of omnipotence.
Many times it
To an
is.
extent.
Yeah, many
To an
times it
extent.
is that you are from inside driven by the search for omnipotence, or you have projected omnipotence onto something outside and you are going towards it, or both of it. Okay, from inside, you want to be the greatest musician who ever lived, and on the outside, you believe music and creating something extraordinary in music is creating something omnipotent. So there is a projection of omnipotence outside and the drive of omnipotence inside, and both of them are driving you into art. So this brings us to this whole idea. There was a very famous book called The Irrational Man. How at deeper levels the non-rationality functions, and omnipotence is one of those entities in that non-rational deeper zone of our mind from where motivations, thoughts, power often comes. And you can see it in spirituality, the pursuit of the guru. And this also brings us not only to the quest for omnipotence, that if I am not omnipotent, my guru would be omnipotent. I can't hear you. Okay. So in spirituality, it may be that the pursuit of the guru is omnipotent, but at the same time, uh, there may be a terrible need, not only because of the quest of omnipotence, but also because of helplessness and suffering. Take, for example, these two cases of Asharam and Ram Rahim. Despite all the evidence which came at a particular point in time, there were many of his followers who deny everything. All these evidences are wrong. And that is because their individual suffering and helplessness is so high. Where will they go? They need somebody omnipotent to bring about stability inside and promise to them some state of reverie. Because omnipotence also gives you the state of reverie. Very a slight experience of bliss. So when they are in that ashram, they feel the omnipotent protection. They keep a photograph of the person and they feel the omnipotent protection. The omnipotent good parent they never had. And if you look at many of the women who are there, they are deeply harassed and suffering. They are beaten up, they are abused, they are used almost like a machine, and they are nowhere to go. They know this is how it's going to be every day till the last day of their life. And in that situation of helplessness, condemned to torture, suffering, they need somebody omnipotent to offer them protection, at least in the inner world. They need somebody who can give them a state of reverie, some taste of bliss, some taste of happiness. At least when they are in the ashram, they feel it. So it can also be a social need that omnipotence can satisfy. And that is why they have to keep it up regardless of any proof. So they have an inner crisis where they have to be stupid in order to be intelligent in the inner world. In the outer world, people will call them stupid who can't understand the obvious. But in the inner world, there is a more compelling reason to be stupid in the outer world. So in the inner world, something good can happen. So
Your voice is a little compromised. Is it just at my end? Can you pause for a while and just restart?
this brings us to the second part. That when you project omnipotence onto a person, how does he feel about it? And that is an area of a tragic comedy. How the subjects of the projection feel about it.
So exactly, I'm just thinking on those lines. How would they be feeling? Because there's so many other things which would be, somebody can be manipulating people. That is where we see many of the cases, somebody living up to their own narcissism. So there's so many different ways. How do they feel about it? What are the more ways they feel?
Initially, they feel it unsettling because they know that they are not omnipotent and somebody is thinking they are omnipotent. In the second phase, they find the other stupid, that he is projecting omnipotence into them and he is a stupid person. And the third phase is when they start manipulating others. Stalin used to call them the useful idiots. So they know that somebody is crazy about them and he is stupid. There's nothing to what he is saying or feeling. It's all projection and fantasy. But he is useful, so they start manipulating him. And if this goes on for a long time, then they become victims of their own belief, that they start really believing they are omnipotent. Because it's so seductive that it's very difficult to keep omnipotence away if everyone keeps telling you you are omnipotent. Now, this leads to very difficult situations where one starts making decisions in areas where one does not have capability, out of feeling of one's own narcissism and omnipotence. Demonetization was one such phenomena in India. Uh, the Great Leap Forward in China and the Cultural Revolution was another phenomena which was driven by Mao's omnipotence. Stalin had his own version of omnipotence of collective farming.
Mm.
So, uh, in history, we have seen that this projection of omnipotence, when it is accepted and it goes to the head of the leader, very difficult things follow. And the suffering is not only of millions, but for generations. And it leaves a collective trauma on the psyche of the community. And therefore, in Chinese, there is an old saying which says, a great man is a public misfortune. Because he will bring about some difficult idea, extraordinary idea, and then generations will suffer from it. Because they have had a history where whom they called omnipotent and they called great, they have done more harm than good. So they have this
Oh.
old saying that a great man is a public misfortune. And therefore, in spirituality, in many schools, uh, to manage omnipotence, it is deposited in a God who is beyond. Like, for example, in Tantra, there is idea of the Tripura Sundari.
Mm.
So Tripura Sundari is beyond, and she is the only one who is omnipotent. And no guru is omnipotent, no rishi is omnipotent. They are nothing in compared to Tripura Sundari. So this, in a way, is used to manage that omnipotence in that school, philosophically, spiritually, and so on. And very interestingly, because this drive is so strong, in every small sanctuary, it establishes itself. For
Mm.
example, let us say there is a school. It's almost like a standalone thing. Let's say it's out of the city. There is a school which is out of the city and very few contacts with the outside world. It's very natural for the principal to be omnipotent, to act as though he is omnipotent, because he always has a desire. He can use his power of employing or removing others to satisfy his desire, and the others, partly to save their jobs and partly to satisfy their need for omnipotence, project omnipotence onto him. So it creates a small kingdom of him where he is omnipotent. Same you will see in a small fire brigade station, which is isolated somewhere, a small police station where the inspector acts like omnipotent. So we have these small kingdoms where people establish their omnipotence and others feed into it. And this is where we are. Given a small chance, omnipotence will establish itself because it's a very strong desire. Anywhere it gets a chance, it will establish itself.
So it brings us to outcomes of omnipotence in terms of quality of life.
It's central to our happiness and suffering both. It's a great inspiration. It's a great motivation, driving force. It keeps us doing something. The very act we are doing at the moment might be driven partly by our search for omnipotence. Uh, we experience the highest positive and negative states out of it. We outperform ourselves. We don't stop. The species does not stop. And the role of history goes on. Often omnipotence is linked to ideology, and that is where the quality of life of countries either goes up radically or goes down radically. And both can happen in the same country in a span of 10-20 years. Like if you take, for example, Russia or China, the poorest of the poor after the communist revolution, they had invested omnipotence in the ideology of communism. They fought and they won. It was a great inspiring force, a great ideal force where they will create a society where everyone was equal and everyone's basic needs will be taken care of. So the moment they got into power, initially everyone's basic needs got taken care of to a great extent. Thereafter, their own purges led to killings of millions. And thereafter, in the third phase, their own stupid decisions brought about disasters in food production and millions died out of starvation.
Mm.
So in the initial 5 years, millions were saved, and later on, millions and millions died in the coming 20-25 years. The same happened in France, where omnipotence was invested in church, and the church and the king both, and they were exploiting the common people, and that is how the French Revolution happened. That
Makes sense.
when bread was not available, people threw away that omnipotence and for once became real. So in the last 25 years, what we have seen is omnipotence being used by corporate communication. And this is something very difficult. It's creating desires that cannot be fulfilled. The product you have not seen in life, after 2 years of advertising, you feel you can't be happy without it, as though you were never happy when the product does not exist. So it is complete hijacking of man's mind and creating insatiable desires and frustration in society. And people do all kinds of wrong things to satisfy those desires created by corporate communication. So this manipulative use by corporate communication of this drive for omnipotence is something that actually needs a check. It's too large a tragedy to allow to go by.
Yeah, even in this marketing world, the slogans themselves and the influences, the way they talk about that something being extraordinary, never felt before. The way they talk about the basic simple product that like a moisturizer, oh, it is from the heavens. And these punchlines just put us to accept and believe in what they're trying to market around. So is the society aware of this? Or how does the society manage if it is unaware and unknowingly handling this entity?
At present, it's largely handling unknowingly, but if you try to optimize, the optimization will be like this, that the real pursuit of omnipotence has to be left to 10 to 15% of the population who has some extraordinary endowment. Whereas most people in society have to live it by identification because they don't have those kind of innate gifts, whether it is of looks or intelligence or something kinetic in the body or brains or whatever it is. So a majority will always have to live omnipotence by identification. And then you have awards, conferences, degrees to help you live out your omnipotence in some small measure. Like if you cannot buy a bottle of shampoo, you buy a sachet. Similarly, when you cannot buy the whole of omnipotence, you get a degree and you feel slightly omnipotent, slightly better than before. As Lacan would say, the lack is filled to some extent, but the lack can never be
Mm.
filled completely. So this is where it leads to a harmless management of omnipotence. But the best management is also uh, difficult management in a strange way, which is management of omnipotence by knowledge. That when you have knowledge of omnipotence, of how it is working in you, in projection, and in others, and you start being more and more free from it, that is the best management. But what it does is it also takes away ordinary juice of life. So it is like if ordinary pleasures go away, they have to be substituted by bliss. You cannot be left nowhere.
And the gratitude can take place
Yeah. Because
instead of
in
getting
between,
into that soft meaning of.
correct. So something positive has to take place of ordinary satisfiers. And that is where uh, there is often a phase that when the effect of ordinary pleasure goes away and sublime pleasures are yet to take their place, in between is a part of difficult existential crisis where you feel a peculiar kind of depression, which is actually an existential depression. Very different from the hydraulic depression that you feel otherwise. So, what applies to omnipotence also applies to love. That one way
Ah,
to be free from it is to have knowledge of it. It is said it is cruel to have knowledge of love
indeed.
because the knowledge liberates, but it also takes away what hopes and what juice
Yeah,
was
the
there
ignorant
or was
juice.
anticipating. So it's cruel to have knowledge of love, it's cruel to have knowledge of omnipotence, but they do liberate. And when the better, pleasant things take over, you do feel liberated. I think that is a good place to be. Difficult, but a good place to be.
More genuine inner life experience to
Correct,
be.
correct.
So, how does psychoanalysis deal with this omnipotence?
We look at it primarily as a pathology. We say uh, aggression, libido, and narcissism are universal human entities in the psyche, at the very bottom of the psyche. And of course, omnipotence is related to narcissism. And that creates a picture of the human species as a sick species.
Mm.
That from a DSM standpoint, very few are sick, but from a psychoanalytic standpoint, everyone is sick. That there's nothing like a perfect mind or a perfect body. And we are not Homo sapiens sapiens, but Homo seculus seculus. That every man is sick in a different way. Tantra says the same thing, that unless you experience states of enlightenment and stabilize them, and you purify the chakras, you are essentially sick. So, therapy looks at it as a point of uh, navigating through omnipotence and getting into the state of reality acceptance. That we are not omnipotent, nobody is omnipotent, omnipotence can never be had in the human form. And the desire that we have can never be fulfilled. And it is time to do mourning of that desire and accept reality as it is. That this
It's brutal.
so pleasant a fantasy, right, has to be given up, and the prescription is brutal.
Yes.
So,
And when you say that you get into the reality, I think the life becomes, for some time it would appear to be very without any purpose,
correct,
because the whole rat race is for this gratification.
right. So there will be a no man's land between ordinary pleasures and more sublime pleasures of bliss, delight, awareness. And so in that no man's land is a difficulty. So this in therapy we also look at closing the split, because
Mm.
in closing the split we are also moving from omnipotence to reality acceptance. The whole idea is of a profound reality acceptance. And we also do exploration of desire and the surreal to create an idea of a good life. So this is what we do in therapy.
I'm still stuck with that. Since there is a book, Man in Search of Omnipotence, there should be something man in uh, hopelessness with omnipotence. There should be a book post that phenomena also. What happens when the when the whole system collapses, when you are in hands of reality, what
Right.
happens? And I'm expecting that good discussion from you in our upcoming discussions.
Um, um, I used to say, how can man face the tragedy, the fate of man condemned to reality? How can one face the tragedy, the fate of man condemned to reality? That is what the myth of Sisyphus is all about. That if
Yes.
all fantasy is taken out, if all omnipotence is taken out, what we have is a hard, juicy, juiceless, and a difficult life. So then we have to search for something which can give us pleasant feelings, very from different sources than the ordinary pursuit of omnipotence.
And when you say that, it also occurs to me that it is to do with the creative life force, which makes us believe into omnipotence. When we talk in the Freudian terms, um,
Right.
the surreal fantasy of human psyche is a power of creation for it.
Correct.
So it is going to assassinate the creator inside of us.
So those substitutions have to be made.
Yes.
If one powering entity is taken out, what else will power?
Definitely there is beyond, but it needs to be brought into people's awareness and
Correct.
see it functioning how it does function for others who have done it.
Correct.
So, is desire and surreal more fundamental than omnipotence? Is where we are now, right now.
Desire is most fundamental. Nature of desire is of the infinity of desire, the infinity of variety, and the infinity of uh, reoccurrence, and the infinity of the surreal. So, what we see there
Hmm.
is that desire is most fundamental. You're saying something.
Yeah, so I was, is this desire is, of course, we have the whole castle of desires above it, but it is very fundamental just because if we will not have a desire, we won't survive.
Correct. So,
We
desire
would
is,
love to be inert.
yeah. So desire is most fundamental. Above this is desire. Above desire is the surreal, and above
Mm,
that is omnipotence. So surreal actually is more fundamental than omnipotence. Omnipotence
mm.
works both in the real and the surreal, but largely in the surreal. The point is that there are many areas of the surreal which are not movements towards the omnipotence. For example, if you take the entire area of twisted pleasures, of
Mm.
masochism, of self sabotage, of the joy of suffering, self destruction, those are areas which are not movements towards the omnipotence. They actually often put you down in different ways. So there will be a area of the psychic activity which is not involved in the pursuit of the omnipotence. The second component of surreal will be even when you are doing logical, real thinking, surreal adds the imagination and the aesthetics to it. And even in ordinary thinking, we have the surreal functioning. It may not be in pursuit of omnipotence. It may just be for ordinary day-to-day survival, but we still have the surreal operating. So what we have is that we have the desire, we have the surreal and the omnipotence, and the surreal being more fundamental and wider than the movement of omnipotence.
Also, the definition of omnipotence is culturally driven to a larger extent, though it's a very psychological phenomena,
Yeah,
which brings this When you this I was thinking when you talked about this masochistic desire, where probably people have this definition of omnipotence which is way too twisted.
Correct.
Hmm. So it is omnipotence and reality acceptance and enlightenment and absolute inexperience. So
Ah,
omnipotence is the sublime destination of human psyche.
uh, we have a sequence. We pursue first omnipotence, then we pursue reality acceptance, then one gets to enlightenment, and then one realizes that there is some absolute which is beyond omnipotence, which cannot be said, but which can be intuitively felt. So this brings us to, is there a beyond to the omnipotence? And the farthest that human mind can think is of an absolute beyond omnipotence. But it is more intuitively felt rather than verbally described. It's difficult to make a positive elaboration of it. It's almost like the beyond, a beyond that intuitively is felt but not expressed. So, in logical sequence of potency, it will be absolute, the omnipotence, and the ordinariness. In terms of the spiritual development, it will be the pursuit of omnipotence, reality acceptance, enlightenment, and the acceptance of the
Absolutely.
absolute. So, this is how structurally we see omnipotence situated along with its friends.
Refreshing and revealing a conversation it was for me, and hope our viewers are going to enjoy this and pour us with a lot of questions there. See you all again. Namaste.
Namaste.